to be able to bring together a number of people involved in studying, running, mutually, cooperatives in journalism, and to delve a bit deeper into this topic. We've got 5, frankly, very, very interesting, very superb panelists. I'm going to really enjoy sort of the conversation they're going to have together. And we're talking about a topic that is now quite close to my heart. I mean, I first came across the idea, the sort of notion of journalistic cooperatives when I was working as a program officer at the Open Society Foundation in the journalism program. And we didn't really fund cooperatives, we didn't sort of know about them. But over the last 2 to 3 years, it's been very interesting to see the spike in coverage about cooperatives, pieces of research being released about them, and cooperatives beginning to spring up, and people beginning to look to the cooperative as a potential model for safeguarding and strengthening the independence of media. And so that's what we want to delve into today. We want to kind of drill into some of these big questions around what is a cooperative, how does it function, and there are a range of different ways of organizing them, and what does it add to and strengthen in the journalistic endeavor? What does it add to communities? What does it add for journalists? And then we'll sort of move on to a discussion a little bit more about, you know, where we think this is going to go in the future. Last point of housekeeping was that, you know, I know the festival wants to experiment with the form of panels, and so we discussed potentially doing this as an interpretative dance together. If you've seen the OA on Netflix, I think it is, much in that style. However, you know, we decided to go with the conventional format for now, but if you want to approach the panelists afterwards, they will dance their own particular piece for you. All right. There we go. So, starting at this end, we have Marc Herman of Deca Stories, Eugenia Siapera from UCD, DCU, sorry, who's an academic studying cooperatives, Ali Tibbitt from the Ferret in Scotland, Lina Attalah from Mada Masr in Egypt, and Bram Souffreau from Attalah in Belgium. And I'm going to ask them first to talk really about their cooperative, how it came about, how they came to be involved, and what it does, how it's structured, really. And then we'll move on to other kinds of elements, more drilling into the journalism and so on. But just to start off, to introduce yourselves, introduce your cooperative, and how it works. Marc, do you want to start?
Sure. Is this on? Is this working? Firstly, thank you, everybody, for coming at this impressively aggressive hour of a Friday morning. Deca has the distinction among this panel of being the cooperative that hasn't really published anything this year, and started in 2014 with the idea that there were a lot of stories that a group of journalists with some experience, fairly long track records, couldn't place. And so the question was why, and at that moment there were serious questions about whether the kinds of narrative stories we were doing would either stumble into a business model or have a business model figured out by larger media organizations. We just didn't have the impression that larger media organizations were really doing the research and development to keep that stuff around, and so it was frustrating. And so what had happened was at that time, Amazon was doing the Kindle singles, and it was going pretty well. And also on the fiction side, fiction writers were having success self-publishing things. So we looked at that and thought, well, none of us really want to write 50 Shades of Grey, but could there be a nonfiction story that you self-published and put on, in this case, Amazon? And so a bunch of people did it, and the answer was yes, but it's a lot of work. You have to do marketing, and you have to sell the thing, and you have to do production and all of that. But, and as a single freelancer, you couldn't afford one story to not work. And of course, no matter how good you are at it. Not every story is going to work. So how do we ameliorate that? So a couple of us talked, mostly people who had been doing international coverage, international defined as anything outside your own country. We were from several different countries. And we said, well, if we combine forces on this, could we produce these sort of single style things and do self-publishing as a group? And that's where it started, and it kind of evolved from there. We ended up till now, we've produced, it's either 8 or 9, 8 stories, which were like between 10 and 20,000 words long, so kind of little digital books. And we created an editing system, so we collaborated on the design and the system, and we voted to publish or not publish the stories based on whether we all agreed that they were good enough. And we put out what turned out to be sort of a series of 8 stories that had reasonable impact, and then we excerpted them in more mainstream publications. One was the cover of the New York Times Magazine. A couple were, broadcast in various ways. And we proved basically that a group of, initially 8 and later 12 journalists could actually produce this stuff, and it would get read and it would matter. And then we realized we had to also be a sustainable business, and that's the part we're learning as fast as we can right now. I'll leave it there.
Well, I don't actually, as Samir mentioned, I don't actually work, I'm not a journalist, so I don't work for a cooperative, but we did a study of cooperatives, journalistic cooperatives that emerged in Greece following the austerity crisis of the last 8 years or so. So our findings were very interesting because Greece is a very difficult place for journalism in the last 8 years, and we've witnessed the closure of very high-profile newspaper titles. So these cooperatives emerged within this context of a crisis, and partly in order to address the needs of publics to receive better quality of news, because the established media within the context of Greece were so much implicated in the crisis. So the kinds of cooperatives that we studied tended to fall in 2 categories. The first was a category of journalists who worked for high-profile titles that closed, such as Eleftherotypia, which closed, and then subsequently some of the workers there decided to create a new cooperative, and this has been a huge success story because they all got together, and that did not only include journalists but also technicians, web designers, marketing people, all the kind of like staff that populated the newspaper that closed. And they got together, all of them put down €1,000 as a capital. There were about like 150 people, so they gathered about €150,000, and they set up a print title with a website. And in the last 3 years of its existence, it has managed to become like the second or third newspaper in terms of circulation, print newspaper in terms of circulation, and certainly a very well-respected one. The model of EFSIN is very similar to Il Manifesto, for those of you who are Italian and know a little bit about how Il Manifesto works. So basically they would, everybody receives the same amount of money as a salary, and they collaboratively run the newspaper, so there is no kind of like hierarchy. There is a rotation in terms of the roles within the newspaper, and they had very big discussions about whether they should be accepting advertisements, especially advertisements that would come from like banks, for example, or other kinds of like corporations or institutions that were involved in the austerity crisis in Greece. And then in the end they decided that, well, survival, in fact, is imperative, so they would accept advertisements for everyone, provided, of course, that these advertisements would have no impact on their editorials. But it so happened that these people did not want to advertise with EFSIN anyway, so the problem kind of like solved itself. The second type of cooperative that we studied emerged out of the fact that there are a lot of very precariously employed journalists in the context of Greece, very exploited journalists who find themselves frustrated in a professional way because they don't practice the journalism they want to practice, and they can't survive. So they said, okay, we have like all these skills, we have all these all this potential, and we want to do something about it, and that's why they set up cooperatives. These tend to be more localized cooperatives, so they would emerge in the context of, for example, Thessaloniki, the second biggest city in Greece, to cater for the needs of the publics there. These are much smaller in scale, so we're talking about, a cooperative of maybe 10 people maximum. They operate only online. And they receive funding from a variety of sources, which includes also that they would produce pieces that they would sell to other media. So that's how they would fund themselves. I think I'll stop here to give everybody the chance, and then we can revisit some of these.
I think, it's interesting to hear from Greece, because we certainly, the Ferret fits that description of journalists who are frustrated with the mainstream media to some extent. So the Ferret arose from a happy confluence of a number of factors. There were a group of journalists who were interested in doing a little bit more. As you can see, we are an online-only publication. It was founded about 18 months ago. We are a multi-stakeholder cooperative. So what that means is we're not entirely. We have both journalists. We have two kinds of members. We have journalists and subscribers. So when people subscribe, they also become a part owner of the project. And the board is, there are places reserved on the board for both readers and writers. And that means that there's transparency of ownership, there's transparency of funding and the spending. So we produce quarterly transparency reports, which tells everybody where the money goes. There is transparency in terms of regulation and editorial and the standards that we aspire to. And so a lot of this stuff is about addressing trust in the media, where we kind of perceive that it had broken down. To launch, we adopted quite a kind of community development model. We were lucky in that a lot of the journalists involved already had a profile in Scotland. And so we were able to kind of poll. We said, we're going to do this. And we polled, I don't think we managed to poll 1,000 people, but we certainly got close to 1,000 people and presented them with a short list of broad themes, what should we investigate. That became the basis of a crowdfunder. And we said to people, if you give us £4,000, roughly speaking, we'll investigate fracking, which came top of the list. And then that short list also gave us kind of stretch goals. And we said, if we get more than our first £4,000, which is a pretty modest sum, we'll investigate the next thing on the list for the same amount of money, and so on and so on. And so we ended up getting 120% or something of what we asked for, which meant that we could do asylum as well. And so for the rest of the year, as well as kind of doing bits and pieces of investigations as they came up, you can see the kind of things that we've investigated. We ran our fracking package, which did pretty well, and obviously that was a really great sort of feedback to the people who'd funded us. And then we've actually had a fair bit of impact with the asylum package that we did as well. And I suppose the final point that I would make is it's almost like a technical one with the website, is that when you don't have to optimize your website for selling adverts, it gives you a lot more space to do interesting storytelling. And play around with the kind of forms. So for example, one of the asylum-seeking stories which we published, which went on to win an award, was written by three different women writers from three different constituent parts of the UK, all exploring the same theme, supported by original artwork which we commissioned from somebody in Scotland. And that kind of stuff. It's not snowfall or anything, which is kind of old news now. But I suppose it's really interesting for us. One of the things which we're kind of fascinated about, and we're still learning about, is how we can build these kind of interesting stories with relatively little money. And on that note, I shall pass on to my next colleague.
All right. Maybe we can go to the English version of the website, just to be... English is over there, on the left. Yeah. All right, so I co-founded in Cairo some 3.5 years ago a website called Masr. And even though it is... even though, of course, values of the cooperatives are values that we are interested in as, as journalists who have a certain kind of politics, but at the same time, we opted for becoming a cooperative out of precarity, to use Eugenia's word. And that's why we always, that's because we always tend to relate to our experience as the offspring of crisis. So we all used to work in a big mainstream organization, media organization, up until early 2013, and there have been a lot of divergences, political prominently, which led to the organization pulling the financial plug from the section that we were running, which was the English language section of this organization. And it was a politically charged time in Egypt. It was a time of a political transformation marked by a violent coup backed by the people against the back then elected government. So it was also very hard for us to exit this big news organization and be able to work elsewhere, and we were faced with no other option than building our own cooperative. So the idea was to come together and create this website and also try to back it by a legal setting that can be a cooperative, but again, for political reasons, it's been hard to create a legal cooperative in the local Egyptian legal context, and that's why we've been also trying to create the model offshore. We've been inspired by models of agricultural cooperatives, but they haven't. They couldn't apply up until this point to a knowledge production operation primarily. And the idea behind trying to maintain the values and the culture of the cooperative within the organization has been manifested through primarily some collective decision-making processes on some strategic decisions within the organization. So as an editorial operation, we are not a flat organization. We are hierarchical in the sense that there are editors, underneath them a number of reporters work. So it's a very traditional setting from that perspective. But when it comes to the institutional setting of the organization, some strategic decision-making processes related to funding, related to assets expansion, and also related to risk management are only done collaboratively across the entire team. And and the idea is to start as of this year to expand the model and make it more of an outward-looking cooperative through a membership program, so similar to the example that we just heard. So basically the idea is to start expanding the ownership model of the organization to members who are not working within the team of Mada, who are not the journalists and the reporters and the editors working in there, but who are loyal readers who have a vested interest in this organization to continue. So that become member and that get certain privileges in terms of access to information about the institutional development of the organization, and also feedback into its development. A certain tier of our membership program will eventually also become shareholders for a subscription, for an annual subscription fee. Yeah, and the idea broadly is to basically try to innovate a different media ownership model in the face of the highly concentrated media ownership structure in Egypt, which is largely going to both the state and an oligarchy of businessmen. So the idea is to try to break that.
Good morning. Apache is a news website with especially investigative journalism and in-depth journalism. We are based in Belgium. We're writing for the Dutch part of Belgium, so the northern part of Belgium. We started in 2009 as a non-profit organization, and in 2011 we chose for a cooperative. The choice for a cooperative is more that we needed at that time some money, and it was an easy way, like to raise money with the general public, especially because for a cooperative there is some engagement. So you can the members. We have some 1,000 shareholders today. The members are really part of our company, let's say. So they decide on the strategy every year. They get some information about how the sales are going, etc. So besides the business model, besides the cooperative itself, we also have some revenues coming from sales, from subscriptions. So we have on one part the shareholders who give us some working capital the first years so we can start our business, and then after a couple of years we hope to be that there is some profit, and that profit has to come from the sales of subscriptions. We have some 3,000 subscribers today, and we have collected some 350,000 euro of capital. So that's the amount of money that we can use for the editorial team. The editorial team today, we have some 5 full-time investigative journalists working for us. There's also a pool of other journalists working for us on a less daily level. Why did we choose for the cooperative? So there's a practical reason for the money issue, but there's also a more philosophical reason. We are, just like the others on the panel, I think, a little bit frustrated with, I'm coming from a mainstream media. I know the pressure of advertisers, I know the pressure of to get some reach and stuff like this. So we wanted to have less pressure, or at least not that kind of pressure. So we said a cooperative is an ideal way to work, because we have like 1,000 shareholders. A mainstream media company has maybe 1, 2, 3 shareholders, or a family, or an other kind of shareholder. So there is less influence of our shareholders than there is in a traditional media company. So the editorial team can work independently. There is no influence of the shareholders to the editorial team. And everybody is there to make some investigative journalism possible. The kind of maybe, so the structure of the cooperative itself, it's maybe a little bit technical, but we are mostly a user cooperative. So like, I think 95% of our shareholders are readers, are persons who read us. We have also some larger shareholders who give like 10,000 or more euros, who invested that. And that those are mostly like sympathizers or philanthropists, because we are a for-profit organization today. We want to make profit, but the profit is to be used again in the company. So in our statutory is also written that 50% of the profit has to go back to the company every year. So it's not that there is a lot of money to earn there. And yeah, I think that's
a perfect segue. So thank you, everybody. So one of the themes that is very, very current through the festival as a whole is trust, relationship with audiences, credibility, legitimacy. You know, we've touched on issues to do with media ownership and so on. So, you know, I wanted to start there, the discussion. What is distinctive about the cooperative structures that you have in place that that provides what's distinctive about the relationship with, what you would call audiences, the shareholders, the people who participate in or fund or subscribe. What's distinctive compared to other kinds of organizations that you see around you? And what does it add to your organizations in terms of their own legitimacy, trust, their resilience? And we'll get on to things like the editorial and the business side in a little bit. But I want to talk specifically about that relationship with the people who are involved in and support you.
I think it wasn't very difficult in our case to establish this kind of distinction because we are operating in a highly restricted context in a country. And it is also a moment where a lot of the existing media organizations, particularly the mainstream media organizations, have very clearly established certain allegiances with different apparatuses in the state. And it's also an interesting moment in terms of readers' interest because as of the early 2000s, the media landscape has been liberalized in Egypt and people started seeing what it takes to see different narratives than those of the state. So the appetite for a different kind of media, a different kind of narrative that is not the state narrative or state-engineered narrative is there, except that right now there isn't so much of a supply to something that would sort of respond to this appetite and curiosity about counter-narratives somehow. So the appetite from the readers exists, but there isn't what's there to sort of respond to that, and there is a sort of regressive or retreating trust in the existing media. So when we came out as a non-partisan group, as a group that is not paid by the state or by this businessman or this conglomerate or whatever, it became interesting for people to follow what's different in our offering on one hand, and on the other, the fact that the content is completely unrestricted. So we cover everything. We are not sort of trying to be careful not to, in order to appease this businessman or this apparatus in the state. The fact that we publish about everything really is, I think, what created this distinction, this idea that we are not part of anything, we are part of ourselves. And then the last thing I'll say is that because our organization is ultimately defined by the group of people working in it, as the people owning it, as the people making the decisions for it, and because we all have different track records of journalism in the country, some of us even worked in human rights, so people recognize this track record and tie it to the kind of production that we put, and it creates a different kind of trust than other existing organizations.
It's interesting to hear it from the perspective of somebody who's working in one place on one story, because what we found was we were all foreign correspondents, and a lot of us have done this work, and you always see the culture happen in the same place. You can go anywhere in the world, but the 5 or 6 correspondents who are working there on a given story form this little tribe immediately. Everybody starts helping each other immediately. And so the big question was, when everybody started getting their stories rejected because there just wasn't money in 2012, 13, 14, can we recreate that culture that happened so organically in the field, and I'm sure happened organically in Egypt too. And that was the experiment. Could we make an editorial structure and a business structure out of this culture that already existed in the field, whether you were going to Egypt in 2011, or you were going to the Haiti earthquake, or you were going to an election in France? Like any of us, if we, it happened in this group. We'll all sit down this morning and we're like, oh yeah, you're that guy. Like, I've never met you before, but you're that guy, and you're that woman, and you're that person. So the collective has that, and working in a big media structure, it doesn't. Not in the same way. There's teamwork, but it's not the same. It's not the same vibe.
Because again, Greece.
Exactly, yeah. I think that one of the things that we found in some of the cooperatives in Greece is the following, and it emerged organically but also out of necessity. One of these small cooperatives based in Thessaloniki, they were kind of like excluded from having access to formal spokespeople because nobody was paying any attention to them. So then out of necessity, they shifted towards society. So that was very interesting. So you know how journalists would go to news sources in ministries, in like the police, the courts. These people didn't have this kind of access and didn't have any kind of formal media capacity. So that made them turn into society itself. So then they became, slowly they built up a very good and a very robust relationship with society to the extent that to tell you a story that they told us, there was a homophobic crime, and the person who was the victim of this homophobic crime rang them first. So they didn't go to the police, they didn't go to anyone else. They rang this media because they knew that they would be able to address their needs. So from the point of view of building trust, we found that this was a very significant kind of, and a very important moment when journalists are no longer geared only or exclusively towards the sources of power, but also have their ear to the ground and listen to the society that is currently suffering. So that, again, build up a very kind of like important social relationship and contributed to a shift of the role of what media and journalism is supposed to be doing. So it's not only about questioning power, but also about addressing social needs. And we thought that this was a very significant part of what journalism should be doing.
I mean, I think if we're talking about what makes cooperatives different, it's really that they have the potential to turn the relationship between readers and publishers almost on their head. And, you know, I don't know how familiar you are with the UK press, but, you know, regardless of whether you're new media or old media, everything's incredibly partisan. Journalists have lower trust ratings than estate agents. It's not good, and in some senses it's not difficult to see, you know, to improve on that kind of thing, come up with a model which is better than that. But I mean, I think the point that I would make really is that, you know, we are engaged in a kind of almost a community development role with our readers. So they have some influence over our editorial direction. They have, you know, and they keep us accountable. So the way that we're set up is that the reader directors on our board are, in a way, a bit more like you know, you might have heard that The Guardian has a reader editor. So they keep the journalists accountable. They don't have direct editorial control, but if we ever get a complaint, which we haven't yet, touch wood, or not a serious one, that, you know, it will be a panel of our readers, our reader directors, who are elected from our subscribers, who will determine, well, you know, what action should be taken and how that complaint should be resolved. So I think that's really important. And the last thing I would say was, again, it comes back to this idea of advertising. And, you know, if you're reading free commodity news on a lot of sites, you're essentially selling your data. You know, you're being surveilled. You've got all sorts of things happening on the website, and all sorts of data gathered about you, which is being sold to advertisers. Now, we only collect, you know, when somebody subscribes to us, all we need is an email address, and obviously Stripe has all the card details. We don't have access to that. And people, you know, one of the things that people have asked us to investigate is that kind of privacy and security thing. So we're, you know, there's a lot more to the trust issue in journalism, I think, than, you know, fake news in the Facebook newsfeed. There's a whole load of other issues underneath, you know, accountability, data use, the ethics which underpin your editorial, which we have tried to address through this cooperative structure, and we think we can address better through a cooperative structure than you can through a PLC or a charity or anything like that. So I think there's, you know, I could talk about that for hours, so I should shut up now and let somebody else have a word. But.
Okay, thank you. That the community trusts you, trusts journalism. We have, for instance, like Secure Drop, which is like a whistleblowing system where whistleblowers can leave some information, totally anonymous. And we see that then it really works, so we receive some information there. But also via other ways, people find us. So we are a small team, maybe some people with things that they want to tell or stuff like that. It's difficult for them to find us. They have to trust us as journalists. And after 7 years already, we see that we have built up some trust. Another thing I would like to add is also the role of the members and the role of the shareholders in spreading the word of the news website. So they are our most important ambassadors. We have a Facebook page, we have a Twitter account, but we know that a lot of people, new people coming to Apache, is also coming from people that they are members of Apache, for instance, or saying you have to read this, or they are sharing it in their community, etc. So that's, I think, 2 extra points that I would like to add with this.
So I wanted to tie that in then to what does that do to you in terms of your sort of business dimensions, the money dimensions, the sort of ability to sustain yourselves as an enterprise, or your resilience on that level. That's what I'm. You've outlined some of the distinctiveness of the editorial, the distinctiveness around the relationship with audiences, and so on. So what does that do in terms of you as an entity? I mean, do you want to start?
So the Ferret has a mixed economy. This year we will probably we're launching a fact check project as we got a grant from Google, which is nice, which will be a new addition to our editorial. This year we will have probably still more money from grants than subscriptions, which is a mixed economy, I suppose. But nevertheless, since we launched over 18 months, we've seen our monthly income go from a couple of £100 to I think in total now we've taken something like £26,000 in subscriptions, or might be more than that. And it's clear that I used to work as a charity fundraiser, and it's no different really when you're relying on the recurring income from individuals. It's hard to recruit recurring income from individuals, but once you've got them, they tend to stick with you, especially if you can give them some value back, which is something that obviously we then have to think about. And I suppose from an economic point of view, it's actually, so many journalists are kind of conditioned to think about clicks and hits and reach as being the ultimate metric of what they have to do. And quite often we have to sort of repeatedly kick ourselves under the table when we're, pinch each other to remind ourselves that we're actually working for 400 people. And a lot of those people, actually, we did a reader survey, which a lot of those people turn out to be not really that into social media. So it's kind of like, is how many Facebook shares we get on a story really the right metric to measure this story on? Because we're working for actually quite a small number of people, and that's okay, it's fine. So the economics of it are quite interesting in the sense that as long as we keep those 400 people happy, and we can find another 400 people like them this year and another 800 people like that next year, and keep growing exponentially, then fine. We don't have to worry about scale in terms of reach and those kind of numbers. So.
Also, as a cooperative, I think it gives you freedom to do what you want to do and what you like to do. If you start a business, you always have to, you need some money to start the business. In a cooperative, you ask, for us it was our readers, our sympathizers, to give us or to invest money in us. But their expectancy is different than, for instance, if you go to a bank, for instance, or if you're going to VC or subsidies, for instance, for the government. They have different expectations, which are not always the same expectations as the editorial team. And for the fans, for the readers, for the sympathizers, they have the same expectations as our journalists. They want good journalism, they want investigative journalism, they don't want to have like 6%, 9%, 15% of revenue after a couple of years, for instance. They just want a good product, and that's possible with the cooperative. So we have that working capital, we're working with it, we're trying to make a sustainable business with it. Our members know that as well, so they know that we are not throwing away the money to all kind of projects, for instance, that we are really careful with the money that they give to us. We give some information on a regular basis, and once a year there's also a general assembly where all the information is given, so they have all the information they want. But they don't expect at that general assembly to hear that they will receive, for instance, a dividend of 10% or 15% or so on their investment. And that is very different from, for instance, we had some negotiations with even social investors and impact investors, but still the problem with them was but we need some return of the money, and so the deal didn't go through. And that's different for a cooperative where the members, we have 1,000 members, they are all giving 150 euro, 200, 250 euro, and then there are some like 10 persons who give more than 5,000 euros. So, but all those small amounts make it possible for us to survive and to make a good business, like saying a sustainable business. So that's how we see the good part of the cooperatives.
Specifically, the business dimension is that we're a disaster, and cooperatives are not good ways to run businesses. There's a reason that hippie farms produce wonderful, wonderful vegetables, but you have to live very close to them because they can't figure out distribution. And we are exactly the same. We initially hooked ourselves up to Amazon's Kindle Singles program, and that worked sort of well. And at the beginning, that seemed like something that Amazon was going to bet on, and then they decided not to. And as soon as they didn't, we were like, oh, okay, well, the bookstore kind of closed, so where do we sell our books now? Well, I guess we have to sell our own books. Well, that's hard. And we are not business people, we're reporters. So we are learning to be business people, we're learning to be social media managers. We're very, very late to learning to be fundraisers. We're not good at any of those things. We're extraordinarily good at telling you what happened in Alaska when Shell tried to drill for oil there, what happened in Indonesia when they tried to evacuate 20,000 people from a volcano. And people really do want to pay for news. Like, the myth that they don't, I mean, you know, the New York Times subscription's going up or down, I don't know, but the fact is, when we figure out how to get our stuff in front of people, which we do occasionally, using our old 20th century old media skills, we know how to sell excerpts to the Times and to Harper's and all of these places, and when we do that, we see a spike in sales and people are willing to pay $3 for this document. Maybe they're willing to pay $3 a month to get regular documents, but to actually run a business, I mean, if you put me in front of a hot dog stand, I'd run it out of business in like 3.5 weeks. I'm really, really good at selling ideas to editors. I'm not very good at selling magazines to people on their way to a bus. And so we need those skills. And so one of the things we learned is that cooperatives are really good for setting up editorial operations, and maybe they're good for running businesses, but we don't know. And, you know, you got to be careful.
Some of that, you know,
Yes.
mix of skills coming into...
Exactly, yeah. I think what was important for the cooperatives that we studied was to have this kind of like mixed approach that Ali alluded to. So they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket, so to speak, because that would create dependency. So if they depended on as subscribers only, then that would be a problem. On advertising only, that would be a problem. None of them wanted to get none of them qualified to begin with to get any bank loans, but they wouldn't want to get into debt either. So they try to kind of like come up with ways that would reduce dependency. So then they would have some advertising, they would have some subscription income, they would have some income from grants, like not Google necessarily, but other projects like some Horizon 2020 programs and things like that. So the important thing was to have this kind of like mixed approach, because things can ebb and flow. There can be like spikes in people wanting to pay for something, but then that meant that they wouldn't have the independence to go after something that they considered important, but people didn't want to pay for it. So then they would have to find sources from elsewhere. So a mixed approach was the one that they found that worked best. So, yeah.
Yeah, as Marc says, the easiest thing for a bunch of journalists wanting to start a cooperative is to, mount a very nice editorial project and then be stuck with the business side of it. But also in some sort of a stereotypical way, in our case, the people who used to work in this old venture as economy and finance reporters ended up being the business development team of the organization, and they gave up their journalistic career, and we're always thankful for that, because they worked hard on building something, and also grappling with the difficulty of the political economy of knowledge production. Good knowledge production is an expensive process and can only be funded through both a set of parallel activities that are very mixed in nature. The one thing I'll say that is related to this notion of being a cooperative is that a great deal of the business model that we tried to put together for the last 3 years is again hinging on community, and we found ourselves in a lot of the times doing business development activities that sometimes bring in money and sometimes bring in community, and those become extremely interlaced. So one of the things we do, for example, is that because we have people who are active in the music and the culture scene as culture reporters, so we found that we can be good at throwing very nice live concerts, again in a context where you don't have too many of these. And these became one of an important source of money for us, as in we organized on a monthly basis gigs through the network of musicians and cultural producers that we work with, and we invite people from within our community to be part of that, and when they come, pay tickets, get drinks, we get cuts from the bar sales and so on, and this is an important part of how we make money. The membership program is also geared towards the community again, and it's a model that we're only starting to activate this month, but that is very inspired from things sad in this panel, in the sense that in return for a subscription fee, you become a shareholder, a stakeholder rather, in the governance model of the organization. So basically, the business side becomes really interlaced with the audience building side of the operation, and I think that's key to a cooperative trying to make money.
Sorry, I'm going to speak briefly out of turn, given what Lina said, but I don't want to be too negative. Like, don't knock editorial efficiency too, which is a business concept, not an editorial concept, the way I think about it. Because, yeah, we haven't generated a ton of money, but we did a $32,000 Kickstarter, and we did, I don't know, conservatively $1 million, $2 million worth of editorial product out of that. When I watch the New York Times do a year-long 40,000-word project on the legacy of the Arab Spring, and they go out and they actually brag about the fact that they spent $500,000 or whatever on it, I'm like, geez, man, give our crew 10% of that and we'll do really well. I mean, like, all due respect to the Times, and I'm glad they're spending a lot of money, but one thing cooperatives do as business models is that they show that a lot of the mythology that surrounds, in our case, foreign correspondence, is just flatly false. When they say, we can't cover, this obscure place, we can't cover, South Sudan because it's expensive, a cooperative structure proves that's not true, because we go out there, we raise, like, I don't know, literally a couple of bucks, 4 figures, and we can do it, and we can send somebody who, is the same person. Not even the kind of person the Times or the New Yorker or whatever would send, but actually the same person. And they come back, and it costs. I mean, we we did a story on gender violence and justice system in West Bengal in India, and it cost, I don't know what fraction of what Rolling Stone's story on the gang rape at the University of Virginia cost, except theirs was wrong and ours was right. And that's a business issue too.
Okay, so that's, as we move into the era of libel.
Oh, is that libel?
No, I'm joking.
They admitted they were.
No, I'm joking. So I think I've got a couple more questions for the panel, and I want to open it out and to discussion and questions from all of you. But I mean, on that, you know, we've talked about business approach, we've talked about editorial, we've talked about all these different dimensions. But in a sense, media businesses have still got to do the basics, like you've got to have liability insurance, you've got to deal with the legal dimensions of your own reporting, fact-checking, this, that, and the other. You've got various things that you have to have in place if you're going to survive as an organization or if you meet challenges. So how do you deal with those sorts of things? You know, you have, you know, whether it's related to sort of closing civic space, press freedom issues, complaints from readers, you know, dealing with even basic legal matters of how you are governed and your articles and those sorts of things. So how are those dealt with? Just briefly, if you would.
I think you learn a lot of things just by doing it. We learned quite a lot. We're working already 7 years on the project. So that's a long time. We experienced a lot of difficulties, like just before we started with the cooperative, we had run out of money, for instance, and then you have to look for, where can you find some money? We have some legal issues as well at this moment. Luckily, we have, an insurance. We have some lawyers working for us who are doing that kind of things. But after all those kind of some problems, sometimes just things you didn't expect it or you never thought about it. Also for the web development team or the development of the website. It's true that you can start with a blog on a 5-minute basis, for instance, but if you want to make it a membership issue, if you want to be sure that everything is working as it should be working, if you want to answer also the questions of some readers, they want this, they want that, and stuff like this. So you just learn on, while doing it, what is possible, what is not possible, and at this moment, sometimes we had some how do you say that, difficult moments, but not too difficult that they can't be solved. So that's how we do it.
In our case, one of the merits of being an assemblage of people working together closely and making strategic decisions in a collective way is that it's one of the best ways to manage fear, in the sense that if you're operating on your own, or if you're sole decision maker, or if you like this accountability of having to make the decision falls on your shoulders alone, it becomes easier to be paranoid and to say, let's shut down. And I always think that if I was making that decision on my own, maybe this thing wouldn't have existed now. But in every single crisis we went throughout the last 4 years, and there were many of them in terms of state intimidation and so on, the fact that the team came together and said, let's continue, it's fine, there's a way to carry on, is the only way how we managed to continue to exist today. And also the other merit of it is that, and I was talking to Samia about this yesterday, is that there is a certain psychological sense of anonymity to the fact that we are an assemblage of people running this thing as opposed to just one single figure doing it. And when I'm always asked, how come you're still up and running and you haven't been shut down up until now, my sense is that, obviously, the authorities should be asked, not me, but also my sense is that they don't really know who runs this thing. We're just a bunch of agile, anonymous people. Yeah, some of us can be more famous than the others, but at the end of the day, they can't really pin who's that one person making this thing possible, because it's not only one person. So those are two merits of being an assemblage of people running it, I guess.
I think from our point of view, I'd echo some of that stuff. It's, you know, working as a cooperative, we're very lucky. We've got Peter here in the audience, who's a very experienced journalist himself. But the fact is, you know, our editorial committee is made up of the journalist directors, and they, you know, we all keep each other straight. And you know, in terms of regulation, as a small organization, it would be very easy for one of us to be, you know, one of us to publish a story on our own, and then be sued into oblivion, and that would be the end of that. And you know, having a cooperative gives you a structure which you know, which we can get. You know, we are independently regulated, so we were the first organisation in Scotland to adopt Impress as our regulator, which is a post-Leveson compliant regulator in the UK, and that, you know, in itself gives us a bit of in some circles gives us a bit of credibility, in others it doesn't help. But I have to say, you know, from a purely practical point of view, they offer us an independent arbitration process for very cheap, because we can't actually afford defamation insurance or anything like that at the moment. So this is another, you know, for 50 quid a year, we get very practical support to deal with that, at least to mitigate against that kind of a threat. Although, I mean, one interesting aspect I should say is that, you know, some of this cooperative law in terms of how it relates to media law is kind of unexplored, and we haven't got definitive legal answers to some of these questions about what would actually happen if somebody did try to sue us. Where does the liability begin and end? And you know, we have to be honest with our members and everybody about that too, in the sense of nobody's done this yet, so lawyers can't give us a straight answer. You know, so all we can do is kind of mitigate the risk from that sense. But there's no doubt that the structure, if you know, yesterday we were talking about whether there would be such a thing as a journalist by 2030 or whatever it was. And you know, clearly, you know, part of the, you know, there are a lot of big media brands which may disappear, but will everybody end up being freelance? Probably not, because you know, journalists need to band together in some form of a structure in order to get this kind of mutual support and to support, you know, independent regulation and to maintain trust and keep standards up and all these things which you can do through a co-op.
Just to say that I think that we shouldn't underestimate the kind of like the legal context, and I'm saying this off the back, not of this particular study, but a European project in which I was involved about freedom of the media in 11 countries of Southeastern Europe, including Italy, where one of the key findings was that lawsuits were used as a means of controlling journalists. So this is very important, and also in the context of Ireland, where the libel laws are really the strictest in Europe, it's very difficult to organize and to operate as a cooperative precisely because of this kind of like liability. So there is certainly need to review these regulations, and within the context of the European Union, perhaps an instance where some kind of like harmonization would be perhaps a good thing. So that's all from this point of view, but just we shouldn't underestimate these legal aspects.
Okay, so as a final question to each of you, before we open out to the room, I'm interested to know. You just talked about the sort of 2030 picture and so on. What does the future look like from your perspective? You know, you're very deeply involved in these enterprises that are kind of moving forward, finding sustainability, finding trust with audiences. You're making, you're doing investigative journalism. You're contributing. You're having impact in a variety of different ways. But what does the future look like to you? What do you feel? Where do you want to go with it? Where do you think you want to go? Where do your members want to go? And also, what do you think the rest of the journalism field or the rest of the festival or however what should they be thinking about in respect of cooperatives? Do you think that there's something that they're missing, or is there something that funders or other, you talked about Google, I should disclose I was an assessor on the second round of the Digital News Initiative, and it was a fascinating experience talking through in the assessment team the range of different applications that came in, and the fact that cooperatives were part of the range of applications, and that they got funded through a digital news initiative about transformation of the industry, I think shows that people are trying to think of a range of different options. So, you know, I'm interested, you know, direct it whichever way you will, but what should the future look like? Or what does it look like to you?
I'm a terrible media analyst, but my impression is that we define our stories as things that we can't do in other contexts, so we're doing them as a cooperative. But then when you look back, that argument's been used many times, and generally the mainstream ends up adopting the stuff that works. So blogs were defined in kind of opposition to mainstream, and then the New York Times had a blogs page, and you know, citizen journalism was considered sort of unprofessional or whatever, but then we looked back at the sort of signal images of the first part of the 21st century, and they were all taken on cell phones by some random person. And I suspect this cooperative, particularly the business efficiencies, I don't think it's going to pass unnoticed that a lot of the stories we've done that have been most successful were originally rejected by the publications that later excerpted our versions, you know, and that story came to light in all of those places. So I imagine what the future looks like is, as ever, we experiment because we're frustrated, and then the parts of that work end up getting carried forward by large organizations. I can't pretend that we, you know, Magnum started, I think, not because they couldn't get their pictures published, but because they wanted to own the rights to their pictures when they got published. And that eventually became how media works. And, you know, we don't know which of our things are going to end up getting adopted, but I suspect we're the laboratory. And some of the mixing of chemicals will blow up in our face, and some of it will turn out to be aspirin.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any illusions about becoming one day a mainstream media, and I think anyways, there's, again, a merit, without fetishizing marginality too much, but there is a merit to, like, acting from within the margins, and, you know, I always consider that the margins is a site of an alternative arrangement that is very important. So I feel that with everything that is happening in both the broader global media landscape and the local one, what would be nice to imagine down the road is that we will continue to be the habit breakers, and we won't, fall into this Stockholm syndrome of, having to, like, activate bots and have them, replace journalists, of having to do videos because people don't like to read, like, to stand by some notions that we believe are still very important, like, long form matters if text is very nicely written and if there's an investment in editorial processes. So things like these, which is going to always disrupt the fallacies around where media would go, and I think that only people operating from the margins can do that. And at the end of the day, there is a meaning to mainstream organizations activating sites for blogging, for example, when we used to blog back in the Times, or trying to capture citizen journalism and turn it into something that is very different right now. But there is this response has to do with these agitations that we have been doing from the margins, and I think that's how we can continue to have a stake in the media industry nowadays without necessarily becoming mainstream or mass media.
Just to add to these two perspectives, I think it's very significant that cooperative organizations perform better at times of crisis. This is one thing. And the second, that they have the kind of flexibility to experiment and to take risks that are not necessarily, wouldn't be part, like a large organization wouldn't necessarily want to take these risks. These are the two elements that I think would maybe feed into the kind of future that exists for cooperatives. A third dimension is, if you look at all these discussions about the future of journalism, I think there is a lot of it that comes from a point of view of technology and technological, what I would call technological solutionism, following Evgeny Morozov's perspective. I think that if journalism does not fulfill its functions, its essential functions, which are to address the needs of publics. No matter what kind of like technology gets invented, I think it's going to fail. I think it's simple as that. Technology should be put in the service of journalism rather than the other way around. So I think if we keep all these in mind, I think that the future for cooperatives is a brilliant future.
You know, there's no reason why the Ferret can't be bigger than the BBC in 10 years. So, I mean, I don't think we should sort of fetishize minority kind of, you know, there's no reason why, you know, a cooperative is just a tool. If your product is amazing, you could take over the world with it. Tremendous. You know, we could do that. But again, you know, in the discussions that we've had in this panel before, you know, planning for today, the interesting thing is how you define success. What is success? And again, it goes back to, you know, are we just trying to pay the mortgage and write some really great stories and that's enough, that's fine? Or are we trying to change the world and save journalism? Well, not necessarily, but, you know, it's, you know, it might do that, but it's obviously not the only answer. You know, there's going to have to be a hell of a lot of other things. And it's a, you know, it's a, at the end of the day, if you're, you know, if your product is rubbish, you're going to fail. If your product is good, you're going to grow. It's, you know, like any other business.
I think the cooperative is a way or a solution for people, for journalists, for communities who wants to start a new media business or media title or medium or something like this in a quite easy way. It's you don't need, well, you need some experience and you need to think over it, what you want to do, but it's easy to start a news website, for instance, in a cooperative way. And the fact that it's cooperative is also so important because you bring together journalists and readers together and they learn from each other, and that can only be a good thing for the final product, I think. So.
Can I just add one more thing? Another thing that I've found out recently, although it has been in existence for a long time, is that this idea of cooperatives set up not by journalists but by other media themselves. So you have like the Associated Press kind of model that is now finding a new lease of life through, for example, in Spain there is a new initiative called Saltamos, which includes Diagonal would be one media that I would know of. Another media, because they're small, they would come together and form a cooperative, and that makes them more resilient and more able to survive within this kind of climate. So.
I think one other observation that I heard last year at the Frankfurt Days on Media Law, which was focused on the Mediengenossenschaft and the media cooperatives in Southeast Europe. There was an observation from Corrective, which is a German investigative publication, that they felt that actually, offering a counterpoint to what Bram was saying, that actually it might be easier to start as a startup and then later on as a pivot to become a cooperative once you have a certain critical mass of membership, and to offer at a certain point in your growth trajectory, to then open out, not an IPO, if you like, but then to open out to members. And, there's a couple in the UK that are doing this right now. The New Internationalist is becoming it's always been cooperatively owned, but it's shifting to being much more, the model is much more reader owned. And even a TV channel called the Community Channel, which has always struggled for funding, but is now trying to become the first cooperatively owned television station. So, there are lots of examples of people experimenting with this as an ownership model and a way of, as you say, pooling resources, trying to develop a hedge against the kind of strains and stresses of the open media market. So, questions? Okay. If you can just hold on 1 second for the mic to reach you.
Come talk with him.
In the meantime, can I ask if anyone in the room has actually either participated in...
Hello. Oh. Yeah, now it's working. It's Peter Gagan here from the Ferret. Just a quick one, almost on the technicalities of cooperatives, and judging by where you're all talking. Some people talked about having a flat structure, which is what we have at the Ferret in terms of decision making. Some people talk about having a hierarchical structure. I'm just wondering, how did you develop your your structures, and have they changed as you've gone on, as you've grown and got bigger?
We started as a gaggle of people who were all sharing all the decisions, and then people got jobs and had babies, and we created a board largely because fewer people were weighing in on everything. One of the things we're going to have to do now is figure out a decision-making structure that's more efficient because all sitting around the campfire voicing our opinions is turning into a small version of hell.
Yeah, I think that efficiency is what dictates mostly the decision-making processes, but also a feeling of not being left out. I think that's also important. So these two would feed and determine a kind of like a structure, but also being able to take decisions quickly and efficiently is very important. So.
Yeah, again, we started off by trying to have 30 people name the thing, and it took forever to find its name, so we thought that it doesn't work this way and we need to be a bit more efficient. So right now it's a question of, like I said before, certain decision making has to be done on a broad organizational level, and everything else that is a little less strategic but still important for people to have a say in is based on a feedback process. So no decision is finalized without a proper feedback process from the entire team, and this is what we do, for example, with salary scales. When we establish the inflation raises on a yearly basis and the salary scale, it is something that we build based on a series of feedbacks from different team members, and then a final decision on that is built on this. But then funding and all these things is built based on collective decision making.
Hi. Yes, we are setting up a European cooperative for a media, which will be the first, as far as I know, in the world. And one of the main issues that we came across when setting it was governance, because we are based in France, and we've been talking to a lot of cooperatives that are existing in France, and they also faced the issue of governance because there's a lot of stakeholders that are also shareholders and that who should have their say in the governance of the company. And in a lot of cases, the complexity of the decision-making process involving all those stakeholders made eventually the company fail. And it was the case lately with a media called Alternative International, who was obliged to shut down because of problems of governance. So I was wondering, how do you cope with having a lot of, in your case, you said 1,000 of shareholders who are also involved in the decision-making process to a certain extent. How do you cope with that? It's partly related to the question before, but I would like to go more in deep.
To be honest, it's still, we're looking for the right way how to deal with them. At this moment, everybody is also still on the same level. They want the same thing. But what we are trying to do is work in kind of work groups, putting people together, because we know of the 1,000 shareholders that we have, of the 1,000 members that we have, not everybody is interested to give their say, to say what should happen with the company or something like this. It's only a small part of them, let's say, of maybe 150, 200 people who are really engaged and want to give their say. And we're trying to do that with not only the General Assembly, not waiting till that moment, but organizing on a regular level basis, like workshops or discussion panels or other panels that they can have their say, and that we then can say, okay, well, to feel in which way it goes and in which way it doesn't go, and that we look for the best solution for it. So it will be normally like every 3 months that we will have something organized for the members, so around a specific topic. The only thing that we don't do is everything what has to do with the editorial aspect, but that's also something that we clearly state on our news website, that members can't influence the editorial line of our company. We listen to them in other ways. For instance, we ask them, where do you want that we write about, etc., etc. But we don't want to give them the impression that they can say, this is an important topic and you will write now about this topic. That we don't want to do.
I mean, I would echo that in the sense that you can't have 1,000 people making every decision about how many pens to buy and that kind of stuff. So that said, there's an interesting relationship between what you might call the rise of cooperatives and tools like Lumio, which can, there are kind of open source tools out there which can help you make decisions collectively in groups. The Ferret is run by Slack, basically, and we've all become hideously addicted to the app and controlled by it. But I would echo what you were saying in that, there's a large proportion of members who are delighted to give you money and delegate the decision making to the board, and the board is delighted to take that responsibility. And that's how it works. That's generally how it works. And so you have to have, and increasingly we are moving from a structure where we have, one board which votes and makes the decisions. We very rarely have to come to a vote. Usually we get to consensus, but there have been times where we've voted, and it's clear, just like any other organisation, there's a chairperson and they have a casting vote. And, that's how the board works. But increasingly we're also splitting to committee systems. So there's an editorial committee, and the readers don't get to see the discussion in the editorial committee. There's an investigations committee, which is separate from the day-to-day editorial, but that's kind of managing the longer term stuff. There is a compliance committee, which the readers are in, but the journalists aren't in. And I think that there's a wider point in terms of, your members have a whole load of amazing skills which you can draw on to help you. And I think if so for example, at our AGM, we had a very participatory process where we had an unconference and we said, right, what are the issues that you want to talk about for your organisation? And so people were talking, a group of people got together and talked about solutions journalism and how we can blend that into our website. Other people talked about regulation, other people talked about actually just the website and, can we move this button over there and that would be a better user experience. And the outcome of that was a bunch of recommendations which the board took on. It was the board's job to consider how to respond to those suggestions and actually feedback in some cases, that's a great idea, but it's going to cost us $3,000 to move that button from there to there, so we're not going to do it. Tough. Do you know what I mean? You have to make decisions. You have to be able to make decisions if you're going to be able to grow. And again, there's no reason actually why cooperatives are any worse for that. In fact, I think they're more flexible. The challenge is to get the right people on your board, and it has to be said that journalists are generally terrible business people, so it comes back to that idea of you need to have diversity and a mix of skills. But you might actually find them within your membership if you look hard enough and ask them. So.
Question?
In italiano. Scusate. Immagino che ci siano delle affinità elettive, ideologiche nei componenti di queste cooperative, per esempio sui temi divisivi come l'Islam o il terrorismo o i temi ambientali, oppure anche sui temi etici. Immagino che su temi così divisivi come il gender, l'utero in affitto, l'aborto, ci siano delle affinità, perché sennò credo che sarebbe un inferno tra di voi.
From the kinds of like cooperatives that we studied, it was very important to be able to be in the same frame of mind with others. These people were very close to one another. They were friends, they were colleagues for years, so they had like the same kind of like perspective on things. In the big cooperative newspaper FSIN, where there would be a diversity of opinion, they agreed on an open editorial structure, and they would say, okay, we accept everything, apart from they had like certain red lines. For example, they wouldn't platform the racist party in Greece, the Golden Dawn. They wouldn't accept other kinds of like perspectives. So they drew some red lines, but apart from this, everything else was acceptable. They used the newspaper as a platform. So yeah.
I think it's true that there is some affinity with the co-founders, that they have worked together before. And what is for the members and the new people coming in as, for instance, shareholders. We started as a non-profit organization. We wrote articles during 2 years approximately, so they knew what we were writing about. So it's somebody who is investing in our news website knows what kind of news he will see and what kinds of news he will expect. And then we have also on the website kind of a little bit editorial information. Where do we write about? How do we write about some stuff, for instance? Where are we not writing about? How is our view, for instance, on the community, on the world? So in our vision, for instance, we write that we are a progressive news website, and then we have like 3 paragraphs explaining what is progressive for us and what is not progressive. Like we are not tied to one political party, for instance, but we are progressive. So we try to explain that in all transparency to our readers, to our members, and also to the persons who want to be a member in the future.
Okay. So one of my children has just come to the back and signaled to me that there are 3 or 4 minutes left, apparently. So he's impatient to get back to his, I don't know what. But last question.
I have a question for the Ferret. I thought I heard you say that you received money from Google. Weren't you afraid, because Google is a big company, that they were buying influence in your cooperative?
It's a very reasonable question, and we discussed it, and we concluded we'd rather take the money and scale quickly and not worry about it. We actually, we didn't. If Google had said we want to own your IP and we want influence over your editorial, then we would have run a mile from it. We would still criticize Google if we want to. We run stories about that kind of stuff, and I have to say, thanks sponsors to the event. They've been tremendous, and we're complete sellouts for this, but just for this year, and then after that it will be fine.
So you could say to other cooperatives, it's safe to take money from Google.
Every cooperative is different, and they will have their own views on it. I think, as I say, at this stage in our development, we felt it was absolutely the right thing to do. And there's no perfect financial model. There's no 100% clean money, as it were. And you can, we took this specific decision on, you have to evaluate every funder on a case-by-case basis. You can't say all private money is terrible.
Or that all philanthropic money is...
Sorry?
Or that all philanthropic money is
well,
perfect.
equally, all philanthropic money, is perfect either. So you have to make your own judgment on that. And in this particular case, we felt that it was exactly the right thing to do, and it helps us to develop in exactly the way that we want to go. So. Okay,
I think we're sort of coming to the end of this panel. I mean, just to put it in a broader context, I think one of the things that Eugenia said as we were preparing for the panel was to try and set it in the context of what's happening more broadly in Greece, for example, around the solidarity economy and other kinds of social structures that are emerging, cooperative dentists and pharmacies and, people sort of coming together in various kinds of associations to support each other, provide each other with services and things like that. And I think to me, it's really fascinating that this is begun to really pick up in lots of different countries. You read I've got this up here and I've been tracking for a few months all the different types of stories that there are about media co-ops. And it's coming up in all kinds of places, Rwanda, Argentina, Taiwan, here, there, and everywhere. And I think it really does feel like there's a moment that's beginning to happen where people are looking at this as a viable option. And so I really want to thank you all for sharing your experiences and for being so candid about the sort of ups and downs of it. I hope you all agree it's been a kind of interesting insight and hopefully an inspiration, and 20 to 30 new cooperatives will be started by the end of the week. Okay, thank you everyone.